Hey, Eric and Caitlin, thank you for inviting me to Let's Talk Ed Research. I'm responding to both of your videos. I think they are both very valid, and I've had to deal with, that first brand new parent who has a child who's being, evaluated for services or just receiving services, and then the brand new administrator who baptism by fire into special education. Special education law it's a lot, and the whole joking about Caitlin and I going to get our JD is not really necessarily a joke. Like, it probably needs to happen. And I know special education law as a SpEd teacher and now a director of a special education program. I know it pretty well, fairly well. And I still find myself going, wait, what? Explain that to me. And it's a lot. And to me, having that further knowledge base, I think, can only help my students. So our research is, we're looking at this whole due process phenomenon. Due process is a scary thing for both parents and schools. And sometimes I think parents just, it's their last resort. They've gone to meetings, this is what's in my son's IEP, they're not getting this. This is what's in my child's 504, why are they not getting this? And there's various reasons why schools can't provide some of these things, both legitimate and maybe bordering on not. I can't say I'm not in these schools. Thankfully, I've not ever had to have that experience in any of the schools that I worked at. We've, very made sure that our children got what was in their IEPs and 504s, and if we couldn't, we made that happen. But that doesn't always happen. And, that's what happens with due process. Something isn't happening. An example that I remember from when I was an undergrad, which I had very little experience in my special education course that I took. I got to take one that was 3 credit hours. But I was at a school and they were getting ready for due process, and it was because a student was granted a one-on-one para in their classroom, and they were not receiving that. School wasn't able to give that to them, but they hired a para for the classroom, so their classroom aide. And there was a para there, but the student wasn't getting the level of support that they needed, and so parents invoked due process. And there's a variety of reasons parents invoke due process. That's why I think a lot of these studies were vague in how to avoid due process, because you can't necessarily avoid it. You don't necessarily know what a parent is feeling or seeing, or what's happening in these classrooms. Hopefully, as an administrator, you know exactly what's happening in your classrooms, but depending on the size of your school, sometimes you're not necessarily always aware until it happens, which is horrible. And I know as an administrator, I would prefer to be proactive than reactionary, but I know that can't always happen in some schools. And I think the reason we get to due process, in my experience, and I've now taken on a role of advocacy with parents, which kind of happened during COVID, mainly because the lines of communication were not, they just weren't there. Parents weren't being informed of things. They had no clue what some things meant. And a lot of it is schools were overrun. They had all these kids for that, almost 2 years did not get seen, especially our kindergartners going in the first grade. And that's where you see a lot of your referrals for SpEd, because, it's usually sometimes the first time they're being put in front of a teacher, even pre-K. And they're starting to notice these things that maybe a parent kind of thought was quirky, or just, their child, or weren't aware that this was something that wasn't necessarily neurotypical. And so they're finally getting seen, and they get referred. And yeah, sometimes it could be a long way. It could be 3 months, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. But we were seeing extraordinarily long wait times last year. And so I started helping parents and sort of explaining all this stuff. And it was so eye-opening that what parents weren't being told, and what they didn't understand. And, when they're in these IEP meetings, people are talking really quick, and they're using all this verbiage that parents aren't used to hearing, especially if they're brand new parents to a child that's neurodivergent. And, listening to them skip over things and looking through the IEP afterwards, and, well, that's not what was discussed, we need to go back and talk about this, and I think a lot of that is how we get to these different. We're not building consensus in special ed. We're just spewing out these things to people, and it's our job as educators, right? And we're not just educating kids, we're educating our parents sometimes too, because they might not have ever had to deal. They might not be neurodivergent like we are. They may never have had to deal with that, and we're just throwing all this paperwork at them. Or sometimes there isn't a whole lot of communication at all. They're getting the baseline of communication, and there's no explanation into what does this stuff mean. I was working with a parent over the summer, and all of a sudden they found out their child had been meeting with a social worker, and nobody had asked the parent if that was okay. There was no communication on what was being done with the social worker, and the parent was like, I wouldn't have minded, but I just wanted one to know and to understand, and how can I help, and what am I doing something wrong? Not every parent has that reaction, but I've seen a lot of parents have that reaction. And when they're in a school and they're with administrators and teachers who are communicating, it makes a difference. I mean, even if I communicate with my gen ed teachers, because least restrictive environment, that's where a lot of my kids are, by just having that communication and listening, I don't get that back and forth, where you can sometimes have that tension with a gen ed teacher. And I wonder what you guys think about that, about the communication. What have you experienced with, in your schools? And, even Eric, what have you experienced as a parent who's just going through this process? And Caitlin, as an administrator, what are your feelings on that? I mean, we're both in schools and we're both dealing with brand new things, and you were talking about communication, making sure that you're saying positive things, and I love that. I always try to do the Oreo cookie method, a positive with a negative with a positive, always end on net positive. But sometimes that's hard, in special education. And I think that this creating a growing knowledge base is by educating and being open and communicating. And I think that's kind of where I'm at, that a lot of this is breakdown of communication. There's not communication happening, and we're forgetting that as educators, sometimes we do have to educate the parents and make sure that they're kept in the loop. This is their child. We hope that they want the best for their child, and we want the best for their child, and making sure there's communication. And I think that's just kind of where we're at.